First, let me be very clear about I'm not singling anybody out. I'm not here to pick on people. I'm not here to make their life miserable. I'm not here to self-ingratiate myself. I'm not here to get something out of it. It's here because I really think that if we're going to be traditional, we're going to be serious about being good Catholics, the content of this thing needs to be understood and respected because it's a big problem even among traditionalists. St. Thomas, remember if I mentioned from the homily, says that modesty is equal to a pure and stable authority. And what he means by that is this equal to a pure and stable authority. He means that our behavior and our actions are proportionate or fit the authority that we're approaching. What happens is that when people's appetites get the better of them, they get angry and they start piping up or something, and it doesn't fit. They start doing things that don't fit who they're approaching. And that's what the real problem is in this whole process. So the person who's modest, he's regulating his external. So he's regulating his approach or his external actions in relationship to the authority. If he doesn't regulate those properly, he's immodest. And this is why I mentioned at the end of the 11 o'clock Mass, I think it was, even if a woman wears a skirt, if she doesn't respect the authority of her husband, that is, she doesn't have this reverence for his authority, which comes from God, then she's not modest. Now we have to understand something very clearly, and this is something which a lot of people don't understand. Authority, which is given to creatures, is never for their benefit. It's the authority the father has as head of the household is not for his benefit. And that's what most people don't seem to understand. It's actually for the sake of his wife and the children. So, and that's something that's very important. And the authority that the wife receives over the children is for the sake of the children. And so it's something that we have to recognize that if we don't respect that authority which God invests in the individual by virtue of the office that they have, that is office as husband or office as wife or office as priest or bishop or pope, then what happens is if we don't respect that, we don't respect God ultimately. This means that for women it's very important to respect the authority of their husbands, and children respect the authority of their father and their mother, even if they're yahoos. God didn't, when you're standing before God, he's not going to ask you, he's not going to say, yeah, I'll let you off the hook for slighting me through this guy, because, well, no, what he's going to tell you is, I gave you authority, how did you respect it? And so we have to be very careful. Trads are bad about violating this aspect of authority. That is, they're very often immodest in their external speech and actions because they're not properly governed or moderated. There are general ways in which people disrespect the clergy. And then I suppose you could say even fathers of households and various other civil authorities and various other kinds of authorities. And by clergy we mean everybody from the Pope all the way down to the local parish priests. And given the current situation of the church, it's somewhat understandable why people are behaving this way. The situation has been bad, priests have not been good. On the other hand, Our Lady said in 1832 at La Salette, the priests have become cesspools of impurity, so we shouldn't wonder why 170 some years later we've got this big problem on our hand, because it's been a problem for 100 and some years. But the point is that the issue is not whether the priests are being bad. Things that people always forget, and this is what the Old Testament taught us, you get the leaders you deserve. You start acting up and being obnoxious, you're going to get obnoxious leaders. And I've seen it. I've seen a group of priests who are completely self-absorbed, only worried about themselves, and every consecutive leader they got was self-absorbed, but in a different way. Every time. So it's like clockwork. So the point is that if you don't like your clergy, well, start looking at yourself. I mean, that's really the moral of the story. St. John Eudes says the biggest punishment that God can send to a people is by giving them bad priests. So the moral of the story is God will give people bad priests if they themselves are not being good. So if you want to be good priests, if you want good priests, you respect them and you start developing the proper virtues, and God will give you the right kinds of priests. Sometimes people will get a decent priest, but they still treat them like trash. Again, it's understandable given the current situation of the church, but that doesn't justify it. Generally, I think the people here at this parish are good. And so they have to, again, I'm not singling anybody out. But in discussing this with various priests and that type of thing over the course of time, you start noticing there's certain patterns, particularly among traditionalists. And so there are some basic things that people have to recognize if they're going to have modesty. The first is basic etiquette. People have to recognize how to address the priest. You never address the priest by his first name, ever. Ever. The only people that can ever be tolerated from are his parents, and maybe some of his siblings. If the priest is a religious, you can use father and his first name. If the priest is a diocesan or in a religious order that doesn't use their first name, it's always father and their last name when you're approaching them or talking to them. Oh, there's one other group of people that can call you. Yeah, well, that's if you're religious, you usually don't go by your last name anyway, so they can refer to you as Father Isaac, for example. Don't be overfamiliar in your salutations. No hugging the priest, no touching him, because of the fact there should be a proper reserve when you respect authority. I realize that the hugging and kissing festing is going on for some time now in the church, but this is stuff that's not appropriate. You don't. Part of modesty is regulation of your externals, and this is one of the biggest problems with dating. People are, as I mentioned, I think I might have mentioned before, people are kissing and carrying on before it's appropriate. When priest comes over to your house, be sure to meet him at the door. Don't send the dog or the 3-year-old to open the door for him. He should have a specific place at the table. Since spiritual headship takes precedence over biological headship, he takes the head of the table, and then the father, the mother, and then on down. Sometimes you're on one of these tables where it's in the round, so there's no one real head of the table. The priest does the blessings, because sometimes you go over and, the mother will just start piping up and start saying the blessing. Like, oh, wait a minute. If I bless it, we're going to get something out of it. If you call for it, it's only based on your state of grace. And I don't know if you're in the state of grace. All right. Anyway, you might be, but that's what, if the priest does it, it's by virtue of his priesthood that it's blessed, not by a state of grace. Children should not dominate the discussions in his presence as a general rule. And I'm not saying because I dislike children. I really like children. It's just that they have their place. And the children should have a proper deportment and not be hanging all over the priest, because sometimes you go over to the people's house and the kids, they love the priest, so they're just hanging all over him and you can't seem to get rid of them and that type of thing. You also should have certain circumspection around the priest. Watch what you say and do. There are some people who are there's different kinds of laity, like there's the contentious laity. These are people who have contrariety in speech, in which they're always fighting for the truth or fighting against falsity, but they're doing it in an undue mode or way. So they'll come up to you and they'll just start chewing on you, and you're like, wait a minute. First of all, you're not ingratiating yourself with me, and if you really want my attention, you should be nice to me. I'm a human being, after all. But the second thing is that, and that's usually not my reaction. My reaction first is, you don't know your place. And it's not because I'm trying to look out for myself. It's because of the fact that as a spiritual father, just like any father has to sometimes tweak the nose of the kid, so you have to do that sometimes with the laity, so that they understand. It's not because you're trying to hack at them. It's so that they can learn respect and become modest. And actually, once they start doing that, they'll actually find an interior kind of quiet that comes from them if they're always modest. Many laity are contentious because they've fought for their faith, but you don't take that out on the priest. Sometimes they'll argue over his legitimate commands. For example, in serving, although you don't hear the servers are really good. I've never had any problems with the servers. But sometimes you'll be in some places where you tell the server to go do it, and they're like, well, why can't he do it? Or why can't, in other words, like, I didn't ask you, just go do it, Arguing over marriage preparation. People will come in for their marriage preparation, and you'll start telling them, the church is against contraception, and next thing you know, you've got this 5-minute battle on your hands because they're already sleeping together and using contraception or something of that sort. The priest is bound by the church laws, and so sometimes you get people who want to influence the priest to do something which is clearly against the church laws, which is bad. The priest may say no to an idea because he has to take into consideration a variety of different factors, which very often people, when they want to do some particular thing, they may not necessarily see what the priest sees. And I say this from 2 points of view. One, because he has to look at the general administration of a parish. When a priest stands up at the pulpit and looks out at the people after he's been there about a year to 2 years, you see the complexion of a congregation that no one else sees save God and the angels alone. And so when someone comes up to you and says, I want to do X, and you realize, oh, that would send this person, this person, this person, this person into orbit. And you say, but you don't tell them that. You say, no, I don't think that's a good idea. Next thing you know, you got an argument on your hands with them. So the point is when he says no, what about the word no, don't you understand, should be in your mind. Okay. Grumbling after he says no or does not address what you consider to be a problem and presuming he is wrong, or when one does not know the whole story. So people have to be really careful. Making suggestions, like that was one of the big problems I had at another parish. People would come to me and say, Father, you should do X. And so I'd say, that's a good idea. So I'd start doing X. They never would show up. So I'm like, okay. So the next time they came to me, Father, you should do X. I said, you're right, we should. Why don't you come down and help me? Oh, well, that put an end to the suggestion making. But the point being is that that's a form of disrespect for the priest, just hoping, not being willing to help out or attend things that you suggest he sets up. Two, there is a general problem too sometimes in the laity. They're more in love with the idea of something than the reality of it. So people say, wouldn't it be wonderful if we had X? So you set up X, nobody shows up. Then you stop it. Well, why did you stop X? Because nobody was there. And then they're like, well, that's not good. So it's really more in love with the idea of the thing than the reality of it. This is usually what happens with people with mortification, more in love with the idea of it than the reality. Fostering discord among the parishioners by bad-mouthing each other. So you'll see this. The priest is the spiritual father. And so these are his children, but they'll start infighting. Now, anybody who has kids knows that when the kids start fighting, whose problem does it become? The parents. Well, and the same thing in a parish. When people start infighting in the parish, whose problem does it become? The pastors, which is a form of disrespect. If you really love your father, you respect your other siblings. And that's the general principle. It's part of the fourth commandment. But you'll see they'll start going around and complaining, bad-mouthing each other, calling each other on the phone to complain about the parishioners, etc. This will often be done under the pretext to tell people so that they can pray for them. Well, I'm only telling you to just pray for this, and then for 15 minutes they're saying stuff they don't need to say. It's just a form of gossiping, and therefore contrary to modesty. This is contrary to the priest, since he has to clean up the mess. It is also a sin against the virtue of piety, since it is contrary to his spiritual fatherhood over the parishioners. So it's something that has to be really careful. Sometimes people will assume the role of teacher in relationship to the priest, or they'll try to usurp the priest's doctrinal and moral authority by trying to take his place as the proper teacher of laity within the parish. You'll see, I've seen that happen in more than one case. A priest will say something, and then some guy usually goes behind his back and says, well, we really know the story, and it's X. When most of the time, that guy's wrong. So most laity have no or little formal education in philosophy and theology. And I agree that most priests today have been not the best in regard to education. They've all been prone to a lot of error, but that doesn't mean that you disrespect his authority by usurping his authority. St. Thomas actually calls that the sin of usurpation. There also comes from a general mistrust of the church, the clergy, because of rampant heresy. But just because of that, you still have to keep your circumspection when you're around him. And the reason I say that is because, even to the worst of priests, I still have strong inclinations. Among priests, it's a general considered acceptable thing, practice to call each other by your first names among priests. But even that, there's still a strong inclination to me to want to call Father. And even if he's a bad priest, I've always treated priests with respect because of that. Because of the fact that they're a priest. This is a guy who could forgive my sins. Sometimes you get people who will try to tell the priest what to do, and sometimes this comes in very subtle ways. Sometimes it comes in constantly trying to suggest to the priest, we'll do this. And then he says, no, we'll do it, well, because of this. Well, no, because of this. Well, no, because of this. So you just... It's like playing that game where you hit the thing to keep it down. You're spending your time doing that. You get people because they won't take the word no for an answer. Assuming authority by buying things for the church without first clearing it with the priest. I have heard of places where people just like buy statuary, and next thing you know, it's sitting inside the church, and the priest's like, where did this come from? Or people will say, oh, Father, I really knew that you would love this. And it's, some psychedelic vestment. And he's just like, Priests get stuck with things that have been donated that are liturgically useless. This is actually why when I was ordained, I put on my invitations, please do not buy liturgical articles. Because I knew people was going to buy something. Although I did have my uncle, he bought one after he said, well, you pick it out and I'll pay for it. Taking notices on bulletin boards down or moving things around in the church to suit them. One of the things I've noticed here is it's acceptable for people to turn the lights on when they first come into the church in the morning when it's dark, etc. But now I've started noticing people are playing around with heat knobs. Well, it's too cold in here. So, and what it is, it's usurpation. It's unreflected. Most of the time it's unreflected. People are doing it without thinking the fact that, Really, I'm taking the place of the priest here. It's just, I'm cold, I want to feel satisfied, and they turn it up. So it's a matter of incircumspection. And so, again, I don't think most people are ill-willed. I think it's just they're not paying attention to the circumspection. Pitting one priest against another in a parish in order to get what one wants, this is called triangulation. Now, parents see this all the time with kids. The mother will say no, so then they run over to the father. Can we do this? Yes. Cool. Then they run off, and the next thing you know, the parents are at each other's throats. But you'll see that with people. I've actually had that. One guy wanted to start a devotional practice. He was talking to the priest that I was living with, and he shows this to him, and the guy says no because of X. So then he turns to me, and I said, don't pass it to me. He's the guy in authority. So, and this is, sometimes you'll see this. I haven't seen that too much here, but this is just something, as I mentioned, most of these things you don't see here. But it's just a matter of people being aware of them. This is the type of thing children do when parents tell them no, and they still want what they want. In some places, particularly among traditionalists, there's a thing called congregationalism. This is when the people want to hire and fire the priest at their discretion. And this is just Protestant. The authority in the church is from the top down, not from the bottom up. And you even see people who will actually set up their own chapels and then want to hire a traditional priest. There is a place on the internet where priests can sign up to be one of these priests to get hired. And it even has a thing where if you want to hire a priest for a wedding or for this, that thing, you can write them in and they'll hook you up with a priest. Failure to make a distinction between the humanity and the character of the priest is often a common problem. So people it doesn't matter if he's a sinful priest or if he's a bad priest. The fact is he has the character of the priesthood, and that's why you respect him. And if you keep that clear division in your mind, it's easier, because even if he's a bad priest, if you do it for that sake, then God is pleased. There is also the problem of worshiping of charismatic personalities rather than the faithfulness of the priest. So very often they don't care about the guy who sits in the box day in and day out for hours on end. They're only really interested in, I just love his homilies. I like him because he gives great homilies. And that's a problem, because it's not, the charism of the priest shouldn't determine whether you respect him or not. It should be the faithfulness, but the priesthood itself. There is also a general denial of the grace of state of the priest. Priests receive certain graces to see certain things within their parish that other people just don't receive. There is sometimes a lack of consideration for the priest's schedule. This is, I call it the McDonald's spirituality. It's the one that thinks that you should have access to the priest 24/7 without due cause. So what do you get? Well, you get people calling when he's eating. I've actually had that. I lived in one parish where the priest would just turn on the answering machine because otherwise he literally couldn't eat. One time, I've had it where people will call up. And this one guy called up, and it was something that could have waited. And I just said, well, can I give you a call back because I'm in the middle of eating? He says, yeah, I know, that's why I called you, because I knew I could get you right now. Meanwhile, my food is getting cold while this guy's yammering on about his hangnails. And this is not to be derogatory. People very often have legitimate spiritual things, and the priest will put his food aside. If there's something serious, he'll do it. Or if there's an emergency, he drops it and he runs. But on the other hand, there should be a certain recognition that the priest is a human being. He has to eat. He also has to sleep. And that also means, because you get people calling from all hours of the day or night. It's getting better now. But when we first got here, people were calling at 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock in the morning. And, can I talk to Father so-and-so? No, he's not here anymore. Is that kind of thing. And you're just like, what are you doing calling at this time of night? Unless this guy kept late hours. But even then, it's a matter of propriety. You shouldn't really call before 9 or after 9. Because sometimes priests will sleep in because of the fact that they might have been up for 3 hours that night in the middle of the night because they had to go anoint somebody who was dying or something of that effect. Also, priests have, in the traditional rite, the required number of prayers for a priest ranges from 1 hour and 15 minutes to 2 hours a day. That's how much prayer he has to do just to fulfill the requirements of the church. That doesn't include his rosary, doesn't include any mental prayer that he does or any praying he does for the faithful that are under his pastoral care. That's just what he's required to pray his office. And so people are calling all hours of day or night, and most of the fraternity priests do as much as they can in the morning because they know the rest of the day is going to be a nightmare. So you got people calling at times which make it very difficult for him to get anything done. Again, if it's something necessary, you call. But if not, have some consideration. As I mentioned from the pulpit, sometimes people waste large amounts of your time just talking to you because they like talking to you. that people very often will get into the joy of the moment of talking, and so because you get a pleasure from talking, and they lose a bit of circumspection around the priest. So they should generally around priests be brief, especially fraternity priests, because most of the fraternity priests I know are very busy, and it's 16 hours a day, and it's brutal. So people should have a bit of consideration. If he doesn't return your calls right away, it's called triage. When Father Branches came here, I'm not exaggerating. It's nothing to look on his desk and see a stack of messages that thick. And so he does triage. He goes through and figures, okay, this is important, this has to wait, this is important. And then he'll get to the stuff that he has to deal with right away, and even then he doesn't usually get to all of it. So if it goes a long period of time before he returns his calls, that's why. There's not a problem of it here, but sometimes people will come into the confessional and they'll ask a question to the priest. And so they'll say, these are my circumstances, what do I do? So the priest says, well, this is the principle, and this is how it's applied, so this is what you do. Then the people will go outside the confessional, and the next thing you know, they're telling, Father said I could do X. And so the problem is that what? Well, he can't defend himself, he can't say anything, he can't do anything, and so it puts the priest in a very bad situation. This is, again, something I do not see here, but it's just something to kind of be aware of. The Lord actually said one time, one should never attack a priest, even when he's in error. Rather, one should pray and do penance that he, that is Christ, will grant him grace again. He alone represents me, that is Christ, even when he doesn't live by my example. When a priest falls, we should extend him a helping hand through prayer and not through attacks. I myself will be the judge, but no one else. Whoever voices judgment over a priest has voiced it over me, because he represents Christ. He's an alter Christus, another Christ. Child, let a priest be attacked, take up his defense. Never judge your confessor, rather pray much for him, and offer every Thursday through the hands of my Blessed Mother Holy Communion for him. Never again accept an out-of-the-way word about a priest, and speak no unkind word about them, even if it were true. Every priest is my vicar, and my heart will be sickened and insulted because of it. If you hear a judgment against a priest, pray a Hail Mary. If you see a priest who celebrates the Holy Mass unworthily, then say nothing about him, rather tell it to me alone, that is Christ. I stand beside him on the altar. Pray much for priests, that they may love purity above all, that they celebrate the holy sacrifice of the Mass with pure hands and heart. Certainly the holy sacrifice is one and the same, even when it is celebrated by an unworthy priest, but the graces called down upon the people is not the same. And basically what our Lord is saying is just disrespecting the priest. And this is something that's an integral aspect of modesty. If you're going to be modest, you simply have to approach priests with a certain amount of respect. The Catholic Church will never fully recoup the tradition until the laity respect the Pope, the bishops, and the clergy, and the priests respect the bishops and the Pope, and the bishops respect the Holy Father. Traditionalists must respect the priesthood because this is an integral part of an authentic Catholic faith. Even if a priest is a Yahoo, treat him with respect because of his character. He represents Christ. You can gain a lot of grace through a bad priest. Not only by going to confession and absolving your sins, but also because of the fact that in his hands, if you offer these things up and pray for him, you will grow holier in the process. Okay. Have this reverence for them. People can grow very rapidly in spiritual lives by having a lot of reverence for the priest. And you even see this, as I mentioned, there's certain congregationalism where they want to hire and fire the priest. Another thing you're seeing is people will come and they'll start making demands of the priest. We demand X, we demand Y. Well, excuse me, but you're not in any position to make any kind of demands. You need to have some circumspection. And that's not, I don't say that to hack at anybody. Your life will be much happier if you just do this. And I know this from my own experience as a child, always having a reverential fear for the priest, there's a great joy in that. Whereas the minute you try and start making demands, what's going to happen? He's probably not going to fulfill your demands, and then you're going to become disgruntled, which means what? You're going to be unhappy. So the moral of the story is have a certain detachment. Even if you have a certain expertise in a particular area, you have to have a certain level of detachment from it all. But I think that it's really a matter of propriety. Getting back to this, I think it's a matter of propriety to have a certain reverential distance from priests. In the past, you were considered immodest if you were hanging on somebody that you weren't married to or related to, or in which you were close friends for years. And I think that we need to get back to that if we're going to have a sense of modesty. And one of the things, actually, that's one of the things, I don't know if I mentioned it from the pulpit, but I'll mention it now so it gets on here. The first principle, the first precept of modesty is, do not draw attention to what is immodest. And by that I mean not talking about it here objectively, but in the sense of, look at her, she's half naked. You don't do that kind of thing. Because then what ends up happening, and that's why I mentioned from the pulpit, a virtuous man, if he sees a woman who's immodest, he'll turn away from it. Because he's got to protect his state of grace, so he's going to turn around and turn away from it. So, and that's one of the things that, but anyway, don't draw attention to it. You'll see that, guys will go walk through going, look how bad these magazines are getting. Best thing to do is just not talk about it, everybody ignore them like they're not there, is actually be the better thing to do. Teach your children to respect the priest, and this is something which is quite important because I think children generally aren't really taught very much about how to respect clergy. And there's also a necessity of developing a filial devotion to the office of the priests. This is something that's important. The priest has a specific office, which is an authority granted to him by God, by which he has certain duties and functions and capacities to perform those functions. And we should have a reverential devotion to that office, even if the priest is a bad priest, because that devotion to that office is in fact a devotion to Christ. And so we should ask Our Lady to pray for the clergy, and we should pray to Our Lady for the clergy. Well, if everybody will kneel, I'll give you a blessing. Benedictio Deum omnipotentis, Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, super vos et manet semper. Amen.